At night, satellites orbiting the Earth capture a familiar image. South Korea blazing with light, Japan glowing like a circuit board, and North Korea almost completely dark. No highways burning through the countryside, no illuminated cities, no visible digital life. And yet from that darkness, some of the most devastating cyber attacks in modern history have been launched. Hospitals forced to turn away patients mid-treatment. A Hollywood studio reduced to pen paper and handwritten paychecks in a single morning. A central bank waking up to discover that nearly $1 billion had vanished without a single alarm being triggered. Cryptocurrency exchanges losing sums so large they rival the annual budgets of small nations. These crimes didn't require guns, explosives, or physical access. They didn't leave fingerprints or bloodstains. They moved at the speed of the internet and disappeared into systems designed to be trusted. The attackers went by different names: Guardians of Peace, Hidden Cobra, New Romantic Cyber Army. But their methods shared the same precision, the same patience, the same unsettling intelligence. Follow the malware, and it tells one story. Follow the infrastructure, and it tells another. Follow the money, and every trail converges on the same place. Not a cartel, not a rogue collective, not a shadowy billionaire, but a sovereign state. This is not a story about hackers chasing chaos or fame. This is a story about survival power and a nation that learned how to steal from the world without ever leaving its borders. What you're about to hear isn't just a cybercrime investigation. It's a blueprint, one that shows how scarcity becomes strategy, how intelligence becomes a weapon, and how the most dangerous criminal enterprise on Earth may be hiding in plain sight in total darkness. To understand how this threat was born, you have to start with a country that never recovered from being broken. In 1945, Korea emerged from 35 years of brutal Japanese occupation, only to be sliced in half by a straight line drawn by foreign powers, the 38th parallel. What followed was not just a war, but a systematic erasure. During the Korean War, U.S. bombing campaigns reduced much of the North to rubble. Entire cities were flattened, factories erased, power stations destroyed, and an estimated 85% of all buildings were wiped out. When the fighting stalled, North Korea was left with millions dead, an economy in ruins, and a leadership that drew one irreversible conclusion: survival would require absolute control. From that moment on, the state was rebuilt not as a society but as a closed system. Information became a threat, movement became a risk, loyalty became a measurable resource. The government elevated self-reliance into a sacred doctrine, preaching that dependence on the outside world was weakness, even as the country lacked fertile land, natural resources, and access to global trade. For a time, foreign aid, first from the Soviet Union, later from China, kept the system breathing. But when those lifelines collapsed, the consequences were catastrophic. By the 1990s, floods, famine, and mismanagement pushed the country to the edge of total collapse, killing hundreds of thousands, possibly millions. Ordinary people starved in silence, cut off from any comparison point that might reveal how far behind they had fallen. Meanwhile, the state endured. It endured because it had learned to value power over prosperity, control over growth, and secrecy over truth. This wasn't just a dictatorship clinging to ideology. It was a regime adapting under pressure, reshaping itself around a single imperative: acquire resources by any means necessary without opening the system from within. Out of that desperation came innovation, not the kind that builds prosperity, but the kind that weaponizes intelligence. What emerged was not an accident of history, but a predictable outcome of isolation trauma and relentless survival logic. Long before the world would feel the consequences, the foundation was already in place. Before keyboards and malware, North Korea learned how to steal using something far older and far more dangerous: trust in money. In the late 20th century, U.S. authorities began encountering $100 bills so flawless they slipped undetected through banks, casinos, and cash processing centers across Asia, Europe, and even the United States. These weren't crude counterfeits. They were precision instruments printed on the same cotton linen blend, using near-identical inks with micro-details so sharp they sometimes appeared cleaner than the real thing. Investigators eventually gave them a name: supernotes. This wasn't street crime. It was industrial-scale fraud. To produce bills like these required government-grade printing presses, controlled materials, and technicians trained to a level that rivaled the U.S. Treasury itself. The operation functioned as a closed economic loop. Fake dollars moved out through diplomatic channels, shell companies, and criminal intermediaries. Real dollars flowed back in, quietly sustaining a regime cut off from global markets. For years, it worked. The notes circulated inside legitimate financial systems, eroding confidence in the very concept of authenticity. When U.S. agencies finally traced the laundering routes through banks in Macau, front companies, and protected couriers, the response was swift and surgical. Accounts were frozen. Networks were dismantled. Pressure mounted. By the late 2000s, the supernote pipeline dried up. But the lesson remained painfully clear. North Korea didn't need factories or exports to survive. It needed access to systems designed for openness, efficiency, and trust. The counterfeiting era wasn't a failure. It was a prototype. It proved that value could be extracted without trade, without visibility, and without accountability. It also proved something else: crime, when organized at the level of a state, could outperform sanctions. As physical currency began its slow decline and finance moved online, the regime faced a choice: adapt or suffocate. What followed wasn't a pivot away from crime, but an evolution of it. The printing presses went quiet. The logic behind them did not. North Korea did not connect its population to the internet, but it connected something far more valuable: its intelligence apparatus. While the outside world saw a backward state terrified of information, the regime was quietly doing the opposite behind closed doors, studying digital systems, mapping networks, and selecting human capital with surgical precision. Children who showed unusual aptitude in mathematics and logic were identified early, separated from ordinary life, and placed into elite training pipelines where computer science was not taught as creativity, but as discipline. Code was treated like a weapon. Obedience mattered as much as brilliance. By the late 2000s, the first cyber operations began to surface. Websites in the United States and South Korea went dark. Media outlets were disrupted. Hard drives were wiped clean. On the surface, these attacks appeared unsophisticated denial-of-service floods, destructive malware, noisy and obvious. But investigators noticed something unsettling: the attackers always stopped short. Systems could have been looted. Classified data could have been exfiltrated. Infrastructure could have been paralyzed. Instead, the intrusions ended abruptly, almost politely. This wasn't restraint born from weakness. It was restraint born from intent. These were not attacks designed to win headlines. They were exercises designed to gather data. Response times were measured. Defensive playbooks were observed. Human habits, weekends, holidays, work hours were logged and learned. Each operation functioned like a live fire drill, testing how institutions reacted under pressure. Inside North Korea, cyber units refined their tools, improving stealth, persistence, and coordination. Outside intelligence agencies began to suspect that something larger was forming, but they struggled to prove it. Attribution in cyberspace is slow, political, and often inconclusive, and that ambiguity created space. While the world debated whether these incidents even qualified as warfare, the operators behind them were gaining confidence. They were learning how to move quietly inside systems built on trust, automation, and speed. By the time defenders realized what was happening, the question was no longer whether North Korea could hack. It was whether it was preparing to do something far more dangerous than disruption. The answer would arrive not as a warning, but as a transaction. The escalation did not announce itself with explosions or declarations of war. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine failure, human error, bad luck. When a major Hollywood studio suddenly lost control of its own systems, the world treated it as embarrassment, not warning. Emails vanished, phones went dead, unreleased films leaked into the wild, and executives found themselves writing notes by hand as if time had rewound decades overnight. The attack wasn't about money. It was about demonstrating reach, humiliation, and leverage proof that a foreign power could reach deep inside American cultural institutions and pull them apart from the inside. Then the target shifted, and the stakes multiplied. In 2016, employees at the central bank of a small South Asian nation arrived at work to discover that nearly $1 billion had been siphoned from their account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. No vaults were breached. No alarms tripped. The theft exploited time zones, weekends, holidays, and something far more fragile than encryption routine. Transfers were sent after hours. Confirmation messages were hidden. Printers were quietly sabotaged. And by the time humans realized something was wrong, the money was already moving through casinos and shell accounts. It was one of the most audacious digital bank robberies ever attempted, and it worked because the attackers understood people better than systems. Then came ransomware. In 2017, hospitals across the United Kingdom and beyond were forced to turn away patients as computers locked up screens glowing red with countdown timers. Doctors reverted to pen and paper. Surgeries were delayed. Real lives were put at risk, all to prove that even the most critical infrastructure on Earth could be frozen with a few lines of code. And finally, cryptocurrency. Borderless, irreversible, anonymous. What began as tens of millions stolen from exchanges became hundreds of millions drained from decentralized platforms, bridges, and wallets. Each operation grew faster and cleaner. Laundering that once required couriers, shell companies, and months of planning now took days or hours. By the early 2000s, investigators estimated that North Korea-linked cyber units had stolen billions in digital assets, quietly converting code into missiles, luxury imports, and regime survival. This was no longer hacking as protest or espionage. It was hacking as industry. A sanctioned state had found a way to generate revenue without factories, exports, or trade partners. Every successful theft reinforced the model. Every failure sharpened it. The attacks didn't just grow larger. They grew more confident. And with each escalation, a terrifying realization settled in across intelligence agencies worldwide. This was not a phase. It was a doctrine. The true cost of these attacks is not measured in stolen dollars or lost data, but in the quiet damage left behind when systems fail. When hospital networks went dark, cancer treatments were postponed, ambulances were rerouted, and doctors were forced to make life and death decisions without access to medical records. These were not abstract inconveniences. They were moments where technology designed to save lives became a liability. In offices and studios, employees watched their personal information spill into the open social security numbers, medical histories, private messages, details that could never be recovered once exposed. Financial institutions responded by rewriting security protocols that had governed global commerce for decades, slowing transactions, increasing friction, and quietly admitting that the systems everyone depended on were never designed for adversaries this patient. Trust, once broken, proved expensive to rebuild. Perhaps the most unsettling consequence was what investigators eventually realized about the nature of the intrusions themselves. The attackers were rarely forcing their way in. They weren't smashing through defenses or exploiting exotic vulnerabilities. They were logging in, using valid credentials, executing approved transactions, triggering systems exactly as intended but at the wrong moment and for the wrong purpose. This blurred the line between attack and normal operation, leaving defenders unsure where security ended and user error began. Each incident forced organizations to confront an uncomfortable truth. Complexity had become its own weakness. Automation removed human oversight. Efficiency erased friction. Speed replaced scrutiny. The very traits that made modern systems powerful also made them fragile when trust was exploited at scale. As governments and companies scrambled to adapt, the psychological impact lingered. If hospitals, banks, and global networks could be compromised so easily, what was truly safe? The damage extended beyond infrastructure into confidence itself, planting a persistent unease that has yet to fade. The world had entered a new era, one where the most serious harm could occur without noise, without warning, and without anyone knowing until it was already too late. The most disturbing part of this story is not the scale of the thefts or the sophistication of the code, but the people trapped inside the system that produces it. North Korea's cyber operators are not rogue geniuses freelancing from basements. They are the end product of a rigid pipeline that begins in childhood. Students who show exceptional ability in mathematics or logic are identified early, separated from ordinary life, and placed into elite programs where talent is treated as state property. Their education is intense, narrow, and relentless. Programming is not framed as creativity or exploration, but as obedience, repetition, and endurance. By the time they reach adulthood, many are deployed abroad, often in small groups, living under constant surveillance, working 15 to 20 hours a day, expected to meet annual revenue quotas measured in tens of thousands of US dollars. Most of what they steal is sent home. What they keep is just enough to survive. Paradoxically, these operators are among the very few North Koreans with access to the open internet. They see the movies, the news, the lifestyles their families will never experience. They understand the lies they were raised on. But knowledge does not equal freedom. Defection is not a personal decision. It is a multi-generational sentence. Parents, siblings, even distant relatives can be punished for one person's disobedience. The choice, if it can be called that, is brutal comply or erase your bloodline. And yet within this system, cyberservice offers something rare: upward mobility, better food rations, slightly improved housing, the possibility that one's family might be moved to a better district. In a society where class is inherited and almost impossible to change, technical excellence becomes one of the few sanctioned escape hatches. This is the quiet tragedy at the heart of the Lazarus story. These operators are not monsters by nature. They are intelligent, disciplined, and adaptable individuals whose skills could have built companies, cured diseases, or secured infrastructure. Instead, their abilities are weaponized not because they choose power, but because the system rewards survival through extraction. In the end, the Lazarus Group is less a criminal organization than a mirror. It reflects what happens when isolation hardens into policy, when scarcity becomes strategy, and when human potential is reduced to a line item on a balance sheet. The attacks will continue not because they want to, but because for them stopping is not an option. This story isn't just about North Korea hackers or stolen billions. It's a warning about the world we're building. When systems prize speed over scrutiny, efficiency over resilience, and convenience over understanding, they don't just fail, they get exploited. Lazarus didn't invent these weaknesses. They learned to live inside them. The lesson here is uncomfortable, but necessary. Security is not just a technical problem, it's a human one. And ignoring that reality doesn't make it go away. If you found this investigation valuable, thought-provoking, or unsettling in the right way, help it reach more people. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden systems shaping our world.